Hey guys, tonight we're unbuttoning our finest ruffled collars, tightening our jewel-encrusted belts, and stepping right into the absurdly restrictive world of royal food rules. Not the no snacks in the living room kind either. I'm talking about real historical food restrictions so brutal and bizarre, they make your local HOA seem like a carnival. These are the rules that forced kings to beg for cheese, queens to eat like nuns, and princes to develop what can only be described as chronic bread envy. So before you sneak into the fridge for a midnight snack, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know if you've ever tried a royal diet, whether that's cabbage soup, raw celery, or just an overwhelming sense of deprivation. I love seeing where you're listening from and what snack you're smuggling into bed. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise. And get comfortable. Let's get curious for a second. Ever wonder why so many kings look constipated in their portraits? Was it the fashion, or just centuries of enforced lentils? Could you survive the medieval ban on butter? Or would you declare civil war after a week of boiled eel? Did Henry VIII really eat swan? Or was he secretly crying out for a cheeseburger? Why did French queens risk execution for chocolate? Did palace doctors have a secret grudge against salt? Or were they just bored? And, maybe most importantly, how long would you last if your life depended on never eating garlic, onions, or anything that looked remotely like fun? Congratulations, you've just woken up in the royal kitchens of Europe. Sometime between the Black Death and the Industrial Revolution, you're wearing tights, you're surrounded by suspiciously sober butlers, and dinner is about to be a tragic disappointment. Welcome to your first royal breakfast. Bread so white it might cause a peasant revolt, wine, that's technically breakfast juice, and a daunting checklist of forbidden ingredients. You think you're about to dine like a king? Wrong. You're about to navigate a minefield of thou shalt nots, and that's for peasants. Let's set the scene. You've survived the ordeal of getting dressed by 3 attendants, each one more judgmental than the last. You're perched at a table the length of a bowling alley, facing enough silverware to outfit a minor army. Sunlight glints off the plates, the napkins are starched with terrifying precision, and a flock of servers stands by, waiting to leap into action should you so much as glance at the butter. Except, surprise, there is no butter. Butter is for peasants, the clergy, or anyone else who doesn't mind being spiritually and physically average. You, on the other hand, will be dining with fear and dry bread. It starts innocently enough. A steaming loaf arrives, white, impossibly fluffy, so pure it practically glows. This is no ordinary bread, it's a symbol. Eating white bread tells the entire room, I am extremely important and will not tolerate bran. If your slice is even slightly beige, you'll want to discreetly slide it under the table before a courtier whispers that you've fallen from grace. Next comes the porridge, but not just any porridge. This is a bowl of milky oats, prepared by a man who's spent his life terrified of flavor. No cinnamon, no honey, and certainly no apples. Those are still under papal review. Just a bland, lukewarm slop designed to calm your humors, keep your passions from flaring up, and remind you that breakfast is about duty, not joy. You spoon it up and try to look grateful, all while dreaming of bacon and questioning your life choices. Then the meat course arrives. Or does it? It depends on the calendar. Is it a Friday, a Saint's Day, or one of the 157 days of enforced royal fasting? If so, your meat will be a piece of pickled herring, looking up at you with the same existential dread you feel inside. Not fasting? Congratulations, you get a sliver of beef so overcooked it's halfway to becoming a medieval shoe. Savor every chew. And try not to show your teeth. Dental work isn't invented yet. and you'll want to keep your molars off the king's agenda. By now, your stomach is nervous and your mind is racing. At the royal table, the real enemy isn't hunger. It's etiquette. There are more rules for eating than there are for running the country. You must not eat with your left hand, that's for witches. You must not slurp, and for heaven's sake, never reach across the table. If you're caught sniffing your food to check for poison, do it quietly. Otherwise, you'll offend the taster and probably get a memo from the head butler. Wine is poured, but don't get excited. Morning wine is watered down to the point of being suspiciously hydrating. Water, of course, is reserved for the terminally reckless and the desperately pious. Everyone else knows it's safer to take your chances with mild inebriation. Coffee is centuries away, and tea is a diplomatic incident waiting to happen. So you sip your lukewarm breakfast wine, and try not to wonder why it smells faintly of regret. Now, observe your fellow diners. Nobody is actually enjoying themselves. The Queen nibbles at a crust. The bishop is mentally composing a sermon about gluttony, and half the courtiers are pretending to like whatever they're eating because they heard the chef's nephew has royal ears. Conversation is stilted because even small talk is fraught with peril. Ask the wrong question, like, "Do you miss garlic?" and you'll be sent to etiquette re-education. Under the table, there's more drama. The dogs, there are always dogs, are waiting for the first drop of food. Occasionally, a rogue spaniel will risk it all for a chunk of forbidden sausage. You can't blame them. You too would leap for scraps if you thought you could get away with it. Finally, the meal ends with a prayer, a discreet burp from the Duke, and a reminder that everything you just ate was less about pleasure and more about sending a political message. In the medieval royal world, the table isn't just a place to eat, it's a stage, a trap, and sometimes a cage, padded with tablecloths for everyone's dignity. The best you can hope for? Walk away with your reputation intact, your stomach half full, and your next meal only 12 hours and 17 rules away. Sleep well, knowing that tomorrow's menu will be just as terrifying. Think the Pope was strict? Try being a king told you can't eat garlic because it excites the passions. Onions? Too vulgar. Welcome to a world where flavor is a crime, and breath mints are redundant. You awaken at dawn in your royal chambers, ready for breakfast. You expect something grand. After all, you're the king, and your slippers are probably worth more than the average village. But before the cooks can even crack an egg, the royal confessor is already lurking in the hall, clutching a scroll and making sure no forbidden aromas drift from the kitchen. Today's sermon: the deadly sins of seasoning. In the Middle Ages, church and kitchen were often closer than you'd think. It wasn't enough to go to mass, pay tithes, and commission an occasional cathedral. If you wanted to be considered a good and pious monarch, you also had to eat like a monk with a bad sense of smell. That meant no garlic, on pain of spiritual peril, and definitely no onions, which, according to at least 2 bishops and a handful of royal physicians, could turn a noble banquet into a den of iniquity faster than you can say allium. Why? Because both garlic and onions were believed to stir the blood, cloud the mind, and inflame the senses. It's the medieval equivalent of banning coffee at a board meeting for fear someone might become too enthusiastic about quarterly sales. Garlic was considered a food for soldiers, peasants, and anyone who needed to wrestle a pig at dawn. Royals, by contrast, were expected to rise above such base cravings. You were a monarch, not a garlic-munching revolutionary. And it didn't stop there. Many courts, especially in France and Italy, created lists, actual lists, of forbidden foods for their noble tables. Garlic, onions, leeks, and even shallots were often blacklisted, relegated to the kitchens of monks, laborers, and that one guy who always brought his own lunch. Eating them risked not just your breath, but your dignity. Show up to court reeking of allium, and you might as well have worn last year's cloak, mismatched hose, or, God forbid, an actual smile. Of course, the rules weren't always enforced with perfect consistency. Some monarchs found clever ways to sneak a little flavor into their diets, bribing cooks, hiding garlic in sauces, or simply hosting private dinners where the only sin was running out of bread. But these culinary rebellions carried risks. Getting caught could mean confession, penance, or, in extreme cases, a week of eating nothing but boiled cabbage. Medieval justice was harsh, and nowhere more so than at the dinner table. Let's not forget the social consequences. If you reeked of garlic at a royal banquet, you might be accused of everything from gluttony to witchcraft to secret peasant sympathies. The court gossips were relentless. Was the Duke's flushed face a sign of romance? Or had he snuck an onion tart? Did the Queen's mysterious energy come from her beauty routine or from a contraband clove hidden in her pasty? The rumours practically wrote themselves. Meanwhile, the Church's influence loomed large. Many fasting days required meals to be simple, which was code for unbearably bland. Monastic eating rules, originally designed to keep monks focused on prayer instead of pleasure, leaked into royal protocols. By the time you reached the king's table, the only thing more tightly restricted than the menu was your ability to complain about it. And so, meals became exercises in restraint and endurance. Imagine sitting through a 7-course dinner where every single dish tastes like slightly damp linen. The bread is plain, the stew is thin, the vegetables are cooked until they surrender. If you're lucky, you might get a turnip with a faint memory of pepper. The excitement level hovers somewhere between contemplative silence and public penance. It's not all bad, though. Without garlic or onions, you never have to worry about post-dinner breath. Intimate conversations are safe, and kissing the ring of a bishop is only mildly unpleasant. Plus, if you ever do need to run from an angry mob, you'll be easy to track. The only person in Europe who smells like boiled water. In the end, royal dining wasn't just about food. It was about appearances, morals, and the kind of self-control that could impress even the sternest monk. Flavor, after all, was dangerous. It tempted, it excited. It made people question the natural order of things. And nothing scared a medieval court more than a king who enjoyed his dinner a little too much. Every Friday, Lent, and about 200 other random days, it's time for fish, and more fish. Royalty's spiritual health depended on their stomachs being constantly disappointed. Let's set the scene. You finally made it through the drudgery of royal breakfast. No butter, no onions, maybe a slice of something vaguely resembling bread, and you're bracing yourself for the highlight of the week. Friday dinner. The royal cook emerges, looking more apologetic than usual, and whispers the phrase every monarch dreads. "It's fish day, Your Majesty." The room deflates. Even the court jester stops juggling and sighs quietly. If you thought this was just a quirky medieval tradition, think again. In most of Christian Europe, the liturgical calendar was more restrictive than the sum of all royal edicts combined. Fridays, fish. Advent, fish. Lent, fish, until you can't remember what meat tastes like. Random saints' days, surprise, more fish. In some years, up to half the calendar was officially meat-free. Royalty didn't just observe the rules, they performed them publicly, like actors in a particularly soggy play. But don't get too excited if you're imagining a table piled high with fresh salmon, grilled tuna, and perfectly seasoned seafood. Medieval royal kitchens weren't exactly a coastal paradise. If you were lucky, maybe the rivers hadn't been overfished yet, or the fishmonger hadn't just delivered a barrel of eels. each one slimmier and angrier than the last. Most days, fish meant dried cod, pickled herring, or, if the kitchen had truly run out of ideas, something called stockfish. Stockfish was cod that had been dried into a material only slightly less edible than your dining table. You'd need a hammer, a chisel, and the patience of a saint to get through it. And don't forget the smell. In a royal hall, on a fish day, the air is less banquet and more faint reminder of low tide. The courtiers try to look interested, but you can tell by the strategic fanning and the number of people volunteering to inspect the wine cellars that morale is at an all-time low. The dogs under the table won't even touch the leftovers. The resident cat has moved out. Still, rules were rules, and nothing ruined a monarch's reputation faster than being caught sneaking a sausage on a Friday. There were even kitchen spies, yes, actual kitchen spies, whose job was to make sure the only things coming out of the oven were properly penitential. More than one royal confessor made a career out of investigating suspiciously meaty smells. The trick was to dress up the fish until it barely resembled itself. Medieval cooks became experts at hiding blandness behind layers of spices, sauces, and decorative pastry. If the king couldn't have roast beef, he might have mock venison made from pike, or a pie shaped like a peacock that upon slicing revealed nothing but mashed haddock and existential disappointment. If that sounds tragic, it was. There are entire recipe books from this era devoted to the fine art of fish-based deception. Sometimes, the restrictions got so extreme that even other sea creatures were drafted into service. Beavers, considered fish by papal decree. Puffins? Close enough. Anything that spent time in water was fair game, which led to a lot of deeply philosophical debates among royal chefs and theologians about the true nature of otters, porpoises, and once, a very confused snail. For the most pious monarchs, fish days were an exercise in public suffering. The goal wasn't to enjoy yourself, it was to demonstrate self-control, humility, and a capacity for stoic chewing. The royal children tried to hide their fish in napkins. The king stared mournfully at his plate. The queen accidentally knocked hers onto the floor for the third week running, all while a choir sang gentle hymns and the kitchen boys prayed for a miracle. And yet, amid all this ritualized deprivation, people found ways to bend the rules. There were rumors, always rumors, of secret bacon stashes, of sausage baked into loaves, of loyal kitchen staff who could be bribed for a midnight lamb chop. But nobody ever admitted to anything. Publicly, at least, the king was a paragon of fish-fueled virtue. Not every fruit was fair game. Some were scandalous, others dangerously exotic. Royalty sometimes had to sign off before anyone could bring them a peach, lest it inspire rumors of decadence. Imagine waking up in your royal chamber, velvet curtains gently swaying, sunlight pouring in through stained glass, and the soft tap-tap of a trembling servant entering with the morning's offerings. The usual, bland bread, watery wine, and, wait, is that a bowl of grapes? Instantly, the tension in the room spikes. Courtiers stare. The steward pales. This is not a casual snack. This is a potential international incident. Because in the world of royal eating, fruit wasn't just food. It was loaded with symbolism, politics, and a lingering whiff of danger. Apples were notorious, thanks to an unfortunate Garden of Eden incident, and to offer an apple to a queen without explicit permission was to risk a full-blown theological debate at breakfast. Medieval monarchs, terrified of looking like they were about to start a new religious schism with every snack, often kept detailed fruit policies. Yes, actual written rules about who could eat what, when, and with whom. The problem? Fruit was sensual. Ripe peaches glistened in the summer sun. Figs promised forbidden luxury, And strawberries were so suggestive that poets had to invent new metaphors just to avoid getting excommunicated. For a king, eating a pear in public could be interpreted as a statement about fertility, alliance, or just dangerously progressive taste. Rumors spread faster than jam. Foreign fruit? Even riskier. Pineapples, for instance, were so rare and expensive that displaying one at a banquet was the equivalent of driving a gold-plated sports car through the local village. Receiving citrus from Spain or figs from Italy was a diplomatic event, with each bite scrutinized by priests, ambassadors, and, inevitably, a crowd of jealous rivals. If the king was seen savoring an orange, the ambassador from Portugal might bristle, and the court physician would fret about dangerous humors from the tropics. Next thing you know, someone's suggesting a papal bull to clarify the moral standing of mangoes. Then there's the matter of food safety, such as it was. Everyone knew fruit could be treacherous. A single wormy cherry could tank a monarch's reputation. A spoiled plum could fuel 3 months of court gossip. Poison was always a concern. Slicing a melon required not just a knife, but a trusted taster and possibly a priest on standby with holy water and a forgiving attitude. The royal food taster's job reached its peak stress levels during fruit season, especially when someone snuck in a bowl of mysterious foreign berries. No one wanted to be remembered as the king who fell victim to the Great Apricot Incident of 1472. And of course, fruit's reputation for causing trouble wasn't just paranoia. There were real historical cases where serving the wrong fruit at the wrong time had explosive consequences. A French queen once banned melons at court, believing they incited lascivious thoughts. In Tudor England, the appearance of a pomegranate on the royal table was an unmistakable nod to Catherine of Aragon, a fruit as politically loaded as it was seedy. In Russia, Peter the Great's fondness for pineapples was so infamous that courtiers staged elaborate pineapple-growing contests just to curry favor, while his enemies spread rumors that all that acidic fruit was corroding his imperial temperament. Even the humble apple was rarely humble. Serve the wrong variety, and you might offend the local bishop, the foreign envoy, or your own grandmother's memory. Was it a symbol of knowledge, of temptation, or just a crunchy snack with too many implications? In the end, fruit at a royal table wasn't just food. It was theatre, subtext, and sometimes outright warfare in a bowl. Everyone had an agenda. The gardener saw a chance for glory. The steward worried about poison. The king wondered if biting into a pear would be interpreted as support for the French, while the queen quietly tried to slip a forbidden strawberry under the napkin for later. Your doctor says salt is dangerous, so goodbye flavor. Medieval and Renaissance courts employed a battalion of doctors whose main strategy for keeping you alive was making your food taste like regret. In the royal court, the word physician meant something different than it does today. Instead of a kindly general practitioner who gently encourages you to eat your greens and get some exercise, your royal doctor is a professional warrior with a strong dislike for anything remotely fun. Their true specialty? Eliminating joy, one meal at a time. As you settle down to your meticulously prepared dinner, you'll notice the food looks beautiful but somehow tastes like slightly damp cardboard. That's not a coincidence. That's medical science, as interpreted by a council of men in velvet hats who haven't washed their hands since the Crusades. Salt, they declare, is both poison and provocation, an alchemical hazard so terrifying that its presence at the table warrants a full investigation. Why such a vendetta against sodium? In theory, salt thickens the humors or inflames the blood. Phrases that sound like medieval poetry but basically mean, we don't really know, but let's ban it anyway. Royal doctors believed that anything stimulating to the palate could also overstimulate the body, causing everything from kidney stones to royal mood swings. to a dangerous outbreak of personality. It wasn't always this way. In ancient times, salt was so precious it could be used as currency. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt rations, the original salary. But fast forward a few centuries, and suddenly, adding a pinch to your soup is treated like a public health crisis. Especially if you're the king, whose digestion is now a matter of national security. One sprinkle too many, and you're on the front page of every scandalous tapestry from Paris to Prague. The royal pantry is strictly patrolled. Salt cellars are locked up tighter than the family jewels. Before every banquet, a parade of worried-looking apothecaries descends upon the kitchen, confiscating the seasonings, sniffing suspiciously at the soup, and issuing stern warnings about salt-induced melancholy. Sometimes the cook manages to slip in a few grains, hoping the king won't notice. But court doctors have the taste buds of a disappointed hawk. Any hint of seasoning, and you're scheduled for an urgent purging, which is exactly as fun as it sounds. Not everyone agrees with this medical crackdown. Some nobles bribe kitchen staff to deliver secret stashes of salted ham, smuggling it into their chambers like contraband. There are hushed rumors of underground banquets, where the truly daring dip their bread into actual salted butter, risking both reputation and a stern lecture from a man with a PhD in medieval paranoia. Meanwhile, the royal family is expected to model this ascetic lifestyle for the realm. If the king can survive a meal of unseasoned boiled beef, so can the people. Or at least, so goes the logic. The truth is, the common folk ignore most of these medical edicts, happily eating whatever makes life slightly more bearable, while the royal household develops a collective case of taste bud atrophy. The consequences of all this caution are both tragic and comical. The king's annual health report reads like a weather forecast for impending gloom. His Majesty continues to avoid salt, as prescribed. Energy remains low, enthusiasm for turnips unchanged. The Queen's cook is regularly summoned for questioning after rumours surface of a particularly lively soup. The royal children grow up believing that spicy means someone accidentally dropped a clove into the pot. And if anyone dares to question the doctor's authority, out come the charts and treatises, lovingly copied in Latin, all arguing that flavour is a slippery slope to doom. It's hard to argue when you don't read Latin, so the doctor always wins. Still, every so often, a visiting ambassador arrives from somewhere like Venice or Istanbul and brings with them, scandal of scandals, a pinch of salt as a diplomatic gift. The court erupts in whispers. Is this the beginning of culinary revolution? Or just the start of a very long argument between the royal physician and the ambassador's chef? In the end, flavour loses and fear wins, at least officially, because behind closed doors, even kings crave a little taste of rebellion, a pinch of salt, a spoonful of gravy, maybe even a second helping of regret. And as you drift off tonight, grateful for your own well-seasoned dinner, spare a thought for the monarchs of old, kept alive by medical wisdom, but slowly dying inside from the world's most tragic potato. The whiter the bread, the closer to God, or so they said. Royals ate loaves so pale they made Wonder Bread look artisanal, while commoners gnawed on brown, gritty slabs and plotted revolution. Imagine stepping into the grand banquet hall of a medieval castle. The chandeliers flicker with candlelight. The long table is groaning under the weight of 1,000 dishes. And there it is, the crown jewel of the feast. Loaves of bread so white, so blindingly pure, you'd swear they were baked in a cloud and sprinkled with angel dust. This bread is a statement, a declaration that you are not just royalty, you are divine, anointed by flour so fine that even the most suspicious-looking knight might bow to you for your flawless dietary choice. But for the peasants, the bread situation is something else entirely. The brown bread they eat has the consistency of a brick and the charm of a sack of damp dirt. It's made from whatever grains are left after the nobles have had their pick. Oats, barley, rye, anything but wheat. That's right, wheat, the holy grail of bread, is reserved for the upper crust. You thought your grandmother's sourdough was tough. Try biting into a loaf made with barley. Even your teeth will mutter a prayer for relief. The hierarchy of bread wasn't just culinary. It was a social class marker, a glaring emblem of one's station in life. If you were lucky enough to be born into royalty, you'd dine on loaves that were as light as air and as soft as a baby's cheek. These weren't just for eating, they were for flaunting. Each slice was a symbol of your elevated place in society, practically shining with your divine right to claim the title of bread eater supreme. But if you were a peasant, your bread was a reminder of your place on the bottom rung. That dense, hard, and somewhat dubious loaf wasn't just food, it was survival. After all, who had the time or resources to enjoy their food when survival was the goal? It was a daily struggle not just against hunger but against the bread itself. Sure, it may have filled your stomach, but at what cost? Your jaw ached from chewing, your stomach grumbled from dissatisfaction, and your body, well, it didn't exactly flourish. Now, let's talk about how they made this royal bread. You can almost hear the medieval bakers whispering a prayer before each batch. For the worthy shall partake in only the finest, they might have said, kneading the dough by hand. The process was intricate, almost sacred. First, they sifted the flour to the point of absurdity, removing every speck, every impurity. If there were any remnants of husks, they were cast aside. Those were for the less worthy, those who lived beneath the glittering roofs of castles. You could almost hear the bread whispering, only the best for the king, only the best. The result? A loaf so pale and smooth, it would have made a monk blush. Meanwhile, peasants were left to their gritty, rough bread. It was heavier, more substantial, and much more likely to give you splinters. With barely any sifting, the bread was made from whatever grains they could scrounge, often including seeds, bits of straw, and the occasional rat's tail. Okay, maybe not a rat's tail, but you get the idea. This was survival bread, not food for the gods. But the strange part is, despite the royal obsession with white bread's purity, it wasn't exactly the most nutritious option. It had the texture of air and the nutritional value of dust. The peasants, on the other hand, often ate bread that was dense with grain, more filling, and far better for keeping you alive. The medieval nobility were essentially sabotaging their health, all for the sake of impressing each other with their perfect loaves. But when you're busy hosting lavish feasts and making sure your table is littered with food that screams "I am important," health concerns take a back seat. After all, who needs vitamins when you have a loaf that practically glows? And don't even get me started on the political ramifications of this bread situation. It was so bad that peasants actually rioted over bread, or the lack of it, when grain prices soared, and the bread became even more of a rarity. That white loaf became the symbol of everything wrong with the system. "Let them eat cake" became the rallying cry of revolutionaries. But really, it should have been, "Let them eat something that doesn't taste like despair." But in the royal court, these protests seemed like the distant murmurings of a far-off land. A land where bread wasn't just a daily sustenance, but a way to remind everyone who was truly in charge. You couldn't just eat any bread and be king. No, the bread had to be a symbol of your divine right to rule. And if your subjects didn't like it, well, there was always another feast, and always another loaf. Not every animal was for every monarch. Some rulers were forbidden pork for religious reasons. Others, like French royalty, shunned it because it was considered dirty. Meanwhile, peasants were probably grilling sausages in secret. You wake up in your royal chamber, feeling like the king of the world, until you remember Tonight's feast is fast approaching, and once again, the kitchen is in a frenzy. But don't even bother dreaming of bacon. Pork is off the menu, at least for you. The reasons are as complicated and contradictory as royal family trees. In many royal courts, pork was treated with suspicion, a food best left to the lower classes, the wild countryside, or, for some, the realm of outright taboo. Religion played a big part. If you're ruling in Spain after 1492, even looking longingly at a roast pig could invite uncomfortable questions about your purity of blood. In England and France, pork carried its own baggage. It was rustic, earthy, and, horror of horrors, associated with the kind of people who didn't even own a silk handkerchief. If you wanted to look refined, you didn't eat pork. You ate peacock or capon. Or, on especially dramatic occasions, something so rare and impractical it had to be announced by a man with a trumpet. This wasn't just about manners or even health. Pork was considered unclean by some, improper by others, and too ordinary for the palate of a king. The medieval court was obsessed with status. And nothing said "I am above you" like refusing the very foods your peasants enjoyed most. But don't feel too bad for the peasants. Wherever the king's eyes weren't looking, sausages sizzled, hams were smoked, and entire pigs vanished in the night, leaving only a guilty smile and a faint smell of barbecue. Every now and then, the temptation to break the rules was too much, even for royalty. You can picture the secret midnight meeting between a desperate prince and a fast-talking cook, haggling over a forbidden rasher of bacon. These covert pork deals were as dangerous as any palace intrigue. If caught, everyone involved would face an official investigation, a sermon from the chaplain, and a written apology to Saint Anthony, patron saint of lost causes and undercooked sausages. Things got even stranger when it came to royal marriages. If a foreign bride came from a land where pork was a staple, the palace kitchens were thrown into existential crisis. Ambassadors debated protocol, chefs debated recipes, priests debated theology. The Queen's handmaidens debated whether to even mention the word bacon in polite conversation. One diplomatic blunder involving a suspicious sausage could sour international relations for a decade. Of course, the flip side was true too. Some monarchs, especially in Central Europe, embraced pork as a symbol of power, a show of abundance, and, let's be honest, an excuse to host endless feasts. A king who could serve up whole boars on silver platters was making a statement. My kingdom is rich, my enemies are hungry, and nobody tells me what to do with a pig. The result? A royal court divided between the pork positive and the pork averse. A rivalry so fierce it could only be settled with passive-aggressive banquets and veiled insults about each other's digestion. Meanwhile, in the kitchens below, the cooks carried on as usual, quietly adapting their menus, substituting swan for ham, or disguising pork as something far more noble, because nothing says clever chef like smuggling forbidden meat past the royal palate. There are even rumors of entire cookbooks devoted to acceptable substitutes, some of which were so successful that not even the king knew what he was eating. What a delightful, delicate flavor, he'd say, unknowingly munching on the very thing he'd banned. All these rules and restrictions meant that the royal table was a constant game of culinary hide-and-seek. The forbidden pork became a symbol of rebellion, of class division, of human desire for whatever is just out of reach. For the monarch, pork was a political statement. For the people, it was just dinner. Spices were the Bitcoin of the Middle Ages. Royals hoarded them, doled them out like treasure, and occasionally outlawed them for everyone else. Nutmeg, the gateway drug to treason. You find yourself seated at the high table, golden goblet in hand, when the main course arrives. As the heavy lid lifts from the platter, a waft of unfamiliar, dizzying aroma hits your nose. Pepper, cinnamon, maybe even a whisper of clove. Instantly, you know this meal means business. This isn't just dinner. It's an economic power move, a status update, and possibly a criminal offense, all in one. In medieval Europe, spices were more valuable than gold. Peppercorns were stored in locked chests. Saffron was weighed with the sade, solemnity usually reserved for royal jewels. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and ginger travelled from the farthest corners of the known world, India, the Spice Islands, North Africa, packed onto ships and caravans, guarded like holy relics, and taxed at every port by kings eager to take their cut. This made spices the ultimate flex at the royal table. Sprinkle a little pepper on your soup, and everyone around you knows. You have influence, connections, and a treasury willing to support your questionable culinary decisions. Serve a saffron-infused chicken, and you're practically inviting foreign ambassadors to quake in jealousy. But for every grain that made it to the table, a dozen more disappeared into the black market, snuck under cloaks or bribed past customs officers with the kind of subtlety that only medieval bribery can deliver. The rules were, of course, intentionally murky. For much of European history, laws were passed limiting or even banning the use of certain spices for commoners. Nutmeg? For nobility only. Cinnamon? You'd better have a family crest and a small army. Pepper? If you were caught with a private stash, you could expect a fine, public shaming, or, in the best cases, a scolding from your local bishop about the dangers of excessive heat in the soul. There was a real sense that spices were dangerous. Not just to the body spicy food, they believed, could unbalance the humours and inflame passions, but to the very order of society. Let the peasants get a taste for nutmeg, and who knows what's next? Social mobility? An appreciation for risotto? The entire feudal system could come crashing down. Better to keep things bland and predictable. Naturally, this only made spices more desirable. The medieval black market in spices was a thing of beauty and constant anxiety. Smugglers carried peppercorns sewn into their cloaks. Priests hid cinnamon sticks in prayer books. Some cooks became infamous for their contraband stews, laced with more risk than a crossbow duel at dawn. There were rumours, always rumours, of secret spice dens beneath the city, where nobles and ambitious commoners alike could sample forbidden flavours and plot the overthrow of mediocrity. Royalty, of course, revelled in their monopoly. Banquets were staged less for nourishment than for shock and awe. Observe, dear guests, the roast swan with a glaze of honey and cloves. Marvel at the pottage, scented with ginger, and what's this? Cardamom? Sometimes, these culinary displays turned competitive. Monarchs sent spies to each other's kitchens to discover the secret of a rival's famed spice cake, or to find out exactly how much saffron the King of Aragon could afford to waste on a single pie. At the same time, court physicians kept a nervous eye on the royal pulse. Too many spices, they warned, could lead to fevers, melancholy, or even a moral collapse that would ripple through the entire realm. Moderation, they cried, as the royal cook, already deep into a bottle of contraband vanilla, added another scoop to the pudding. In the end, the laws, lectures, and locked cabinets couldn't keep the spices down. People want what they can't have, and the forbidden flavour only made the blandness of everyday bread harder to bear. Even as the punishments grew harsher, the appetite for a little excitement, a little colour, a little secret heat, was impossible to stamp out. When the calendar called for fasting, even kings had to swap their roast beef for soup that tasted like boiled patience. Royalty were expected to set a pious example. They mostly set examples of creative cheating. It's day one of Lent. You're the monarch of a realm you technically own, but for the next 6 weeks, the real power in your life is a parchment scroll covered in red ink and the world's least appetizing menu. The chaplain has arrived with a gentle reminder: 42 days of self-denial, minimal pleasure, and maximum grumbling. The kitchens are forbidden from serving meat, eggs, cheese, or anything that could accidentally remind you of happiness. Instead, the royal table is transformed into a beige buffet of lentils, boiled greens, and an endless parade of what can only be described as sad soup. The cook, usually an artist of roast game and elaborate pies, now stands over cauldrons of watery stew, gently stirring and occasionally weeping into the pot for seasoning. No bacon, no butter, and absolutely no roast swan wrapped in gold leaf. Lent is here, and your taste buds are in mourning. It isn't just Lent. Fasting days pop up with suspicious frequency. Ember days, rogation days, random saints' feast days, and that one mysterious Friday in November no one can explain. For nearly half the year, some courtier is announcing another dietary restriction in the name of spiritual discipline. It's less a religious calendar and more a slow-motion ambush on your digestive system. On paper, this is a test of piety, humility, and restraint. In reality, it's a contest to see how creatively you can break the rules without actually breaking them. The game is simple. How much forbidden pleasure can you sneak past the confessor? The kitchens get creative. Fish, technically permitted, becomes the loophole through which an entire menagerie of questionable seafood parades onto the royal table. Beaver tails, aquatic, apparently, puffin, surprisingly good swimmers. Anything that ever considered taking a bath might end up on your plate. Of course, there's always the humble lentil. It's cheap, nutritious, and guaranteed to make you appreciate meat in ways you never thought possible. The royal cook does their best, but there's only so much you can do to make a bowl of lentils feel festive. Every day, the courtiers approach the pot with a mix of resignation and hope, hoping maybe today there's a hint of spice, a rogue turnip, or, if the chef is feeling truly reckless, a crust of bread that didn't come from the penitential pile. But Lent isn't just about the food. It's a performance. Royalty are expected to look appropriately miserable at all times. Eyes heavenward, lips pursed, and hands folded in noble, hungry humility. Secretly, though, everyone is counting down the days to Easter, with the intensity of a child waiting for Christmas. Behind closed doors, there are rumors of midnight snacks. A sliver of cheese here, a suspiciously meaty pie there. No one ever admits anything, but the kitchen boys have learned to keep secrets. And the palace cat always seems unusually well fed during fasts. Some monarchs, desperate for variety, commission entirely new dishes designed to trick the letter of the law. Mock meats become the culinary fashion. Fish is sculpted to look like roasted fowl. Almond milk stands in for cream. Eels are baked into pies and served with so much ceremony that even the archbishop forgets what's inside. It's a yearly arms race of deception, innovation, and plausible deniability. The most legendary royal fasters manage to emerge thinner, holier, and, if they play their cards right, more beloved by the church. But for most, Lent is a time of rumbling stomachs, whispered complaints, and wild fantasies about bacon. The real miracle isn't spiritual transformation. It's surviving 6 weeks of lentil pottage without plotting a coup against your own chef. At various times, dairy was considered peasant food, suspicious, or downright sinful. Royals would rather die, and sometimes did, than be caught with a wedge of cheddar. Picture yourself as a king, decked out in silk, seated on a throne that's mostly for show and back pain. It's lunchtime, and the table is groaning under the weight of gilded platters. Roasted game, delicate pastries, jellied meats in impossible shapes. But conspicuously absent from this parade of decadence cheese. No brie, no camembert, not even a humble smear of butter. You eye the bread, dry as the royal sense of humour, and wonder how a life so rich could be so lactose deficient. The truth is, the royal relationship with dairy was complicated, full of suspicion and snobbery. Medieval courts had a hierarchy for everything, and food was no exception. Cheese, with its rustic whiff and unpredictable textures, was just a little too honest for royal comfort. It was the food of peasants and shepherds, people who milked their own animals, sweated in the sun, and knew exactly what went into their food, because they made it themselves. All of which was, frankly, alarming to anyone who spent their days issuing decrees and avoiding sunlight. Sometimes, the problem was more than just class anxiety. There were stretches of history, thanks to monastic diets and weird medical theories, when dairy was considered vaguely sinful. Medieval doctors liked to argue that cheese was cold and moist, two words you never want attached to your lunch. They believed cheese could unbalance your humors, slow your digestion, and make you sad, melancholic, or even inappropriate at banquets. If you were especially unlucky, you'd get the dreaded physician's lecture, "Sire, that Gouda is simply too cheerful for your spleen. Best stick with boiled parsnips and light weeping." Then there were the scandals. One royal French household famously declared cheese unsuitable for refined company, ensuring its immediate popularity everywhere else. In the English court, the arrival of a cheddar wheel could spark weeks of political intrigue. Who smuggled it in, who ate it, and, most importantly, who would take the blame when the bishop complained about the smell of temptation. Even the mere suspicion of dairy was enough to send courtiers scrambling for plausible alibis. The ban on cheese didn't extend to everyone equally. Queens and princesses sometimes rebelled, sneaking nibbles of soft cheese behind tapestries or blaming the family dog for suspicious stains on their napkins. Cooks, faced with the impossible task of keeping the court both healthy and happy, invented mock cheese, strange concoctions of almonds, herbs, and optimism, molded into wedges and presented with a flourish. If you can't have the real thing, at least you can pretend. Pretending is, after all, the main skill of any successful royal. Meanwhile, out in the countryside, cheese was having the time of its life. Peasants made cheese out of everything: cow, sheep, goat, even the occasional rogue donkey. It was portable, storable, and, most importantly, didn't require the royal physician's approval. Village festivals revolved around cheese wheels the size of wagon wheels. Children grew up on curds and dreams. The only real danger was accidentally inventing a cheese so strong it developed its own personality and tried to join the town council. Of course, things changed, eventually, as the Renaissance rolled in and kings began to discover the wonders of French wine. Cheese crept back into the good graces of the court. But the old anxieties lingered. Every wedge was a risk, every bite a tiny rebellion against centuries of culinary paranoia. Some kings remained wary to the end. Legend has it one monarch refused to eat cheese because he feared it would make him dream of peasants. Honestly, a risk worth taking. So tonight, as you drift off with visions of cheese plates dancing through your head, be grateful you live in an age where dairy is just food, not an existential threat. And if you sneak a bit of midnight cheddar, remember, you're braver than 1,000 kings, and probably happier too. Drinking water was for the desperate. Royals preferred their liquids alcoholic, boiled, or ideally both. Water was full of humours, and nobody wanted an accidental bath in disease. Step into the shoes of a medieval king or queen and imagine your thirst. You might think a cold glass of water would be just the thing, but one look from your court physician, and you'd think again. Water was considered about as trustworthy as a tax collector with a twinkle in his eye. The stuff that flowed from rivers, wells, or, God forbid, moats was treated with the suspicion usually reserved for sorcerers, jesters, and suspicious cousins who wanted a slice of the inheritance. This wasn't just royal paranoia, it was a matter of survival. Castles were not exactly known for their advanced plumbing. The best you could hope for was a sluggish well in the courtyard, the contents of which were, how shall we say, nutritionally diverse. After all, medieval hygiene standard was somewhere between medieval and please don't ask. Laundry, chamber pots, livestock, and the occasional bored servant all contributed their own special seasoning to the water supply. By the time it reached the kitchen, a goblet of the stuff was more soup of the day than hydration. So what did the royals drink? Anything but water, preferably something that would burn away the memory of water altogether. Ale and beer were the staples. Even the tiniest princes and princesses started their day with a mug of small beer, which was low in alcohol but high in not killing you immediately. Wine, of course, was the gold standard: red, white, spiced, mulled, or mixed with honey. If you wanted to show off, you sipped wine imported from France, preferably at breakfast, with a knowing look that said, "I trust the grape, not the well." For the health-conscious monarch, there was always boiled water, served warm and, ideally, mixed with something else, like lemon, herbs, or enough sugar to launch a revolt. Boiling killed off the nastier bugs, or at least made you feel like you were trying. But woe to the servant who handed the king a glass of water with suspicious floating bits. There was no quicker way to earn a demotion, or possibly a transfer to moat cleaning duty. Physicians, always eager to justify their wages, insisted that water was packed with bad humors, invisible forces responsible for everything from headaches to failed marriages. A few sips could leave you with a fever, a stomachache, or a full-blown existential crisis. "Sire, your melancholy is from drinking the well water," they'd say, while quietly pouring themselves another mug of wine. Medieval doctors prescribed anything but water: beer for breakfast, wine for supper, and maybe a dash of posset, hot milk curdled with ale, which somehow managed to be less appetizing than either ingredient alone. For those cold, lonely castle nights. Of course, these rules were never perfect. Sometimes, when supplies ran low or the wine shipments were late, desperate times called for desperate measures. That's when someone would make the dangerous suggestion: "Perhaps we could try the water." The silence would be deafening. The king would sigh. The queen would cross herself, and the royal taster would start making his peace with the saints. Meanwhile, peasants didn't have much choice. They drank from the same rivers they bathed in, washed their tunics in, and occasionally fished the neighbor's hat out of. Their immune systems became legendary, forged in the fires of repeated, dubious hydration. For them, the danger of water was just another fact of life, one they managed with a combination of luck, indifference, and beer. Still, even in the highest halls, the suspicion of water never truly faded. If you visited the royal kitchens at midnight, you might find the cooks boiling pot after pot, adding herbs, wine, and prayers. On feast days, when the fountains ran with wine, the children danced, and the royal physicians breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that the only thing in danger was the king's dignity. Table manners were deadly serious. Drop a beat on your white tablecloth, and you might find yourself exiled, or at least moved down the line of succession. It all began with the linen. In royal courts, the tablecloth wasn't just a handy way to keep the table from sticking to your forearms. It was a weapon of social warfare. The cloth had to be dazzlingly white, impossibly crisp, and so, thoroughly starched it could double as a shield in a pinch. When the servants laid it out, you'd swear they were unrolling a scroll of law. In a sense, they were. One wrong move, and you'd be breaking all the rules. Now, imagine you're sitting at this table. The king is at one end, inspecting the tablecloth as if it holds the secrets of the realm. The queen is halfway down, her napkin folded so sharply it could slice cheese, and you, just a humble duke, or maybe the second cousin of a prince, are sweating bullets over a plate of boiled turnips, praying none of them leap to freedom and roll across the immaculate white. Why the obsession? Clean linens were the sign of true civilization. They said, "We are not peasants who wipe our faces on our sleeves and consider dirt a condiment." A white cloth proved your household could afford soap, servants, and an annual supply of drama over gravy stains. The whiter the cloth, the purer the bloodline. Or at least, that's what you wanted the visiting dignitaries to believe. Of course, this led to table manners, so elaborate they would give modern etiquette coaches a migraine. Forks had to be held just so. Knives could only be wiped on designated bread. And don't even think about licking your fingers. Unless, of course, you were the king, in which case you set the fashion by doing whatever you liked and pretending it was tradition. There were elaborate codes for everything: where to set your spoon, when to sip your wine, and how to politely ignore the fact that your neighbor just dropped a parsnip into his lap. The stakes were high, especially for the up-and-coming noble. One errant splash of pottage, one smudge of jam, and your social ambitions could be dashed for a generation. Gossip travelled fast, faster than the serving boys. There are tales of dukes who never recovered from a single butter blotch, doomed to eat at the far end of the table, next to the salt, and out of earshot of anything interesting. Some monarchs took the whole thing to new heights. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, was known to inspect the tablecloth for imperfections, reportedly sending servants into fits of panic with a single well-placed eyebrow raise. In Russia, the Tsar's linen was so prized that it had its own guard, lest a crumb of rye sully its glory. The English Tudors, never once to miss a good opportunity for drama, would change tablecloths between every course, each new cloth whiter than the last, as if daring the guests to find fault. Behind the scenes, a small army of laundresses toiled in a never-ending war against stains. Beet juice, red wine, the occasional rogue cherry. They faced it all with cauldrons of lye and the haunted look of people who'd seen too many royal banquets. For them, a successful dinner was one where no one noticed the linens at all. But for you, seated in the candlelit splendor of the great hall, every movement is a test. Will your soup stay in the bowl? Can you eat a grape without catastrophe? Is your napkin folded properly? Or is it about to betray you? Every meal is a performance, and the tablecloth is both your stage and your critic. Every bite was a gamble. Poisoned pies, laced stews, and suspiciously green gravy made food tasting a full-time job, one you'd rather not win. In the candlelit depths of the royal dining hall, there sits a person with the most stressful job in history: the court taster. Their resume? Strong stomach, quick reflexes, and a complete lack of self-preservation instincts. When you hear eating for a living, you might think of celebrity chefs or enthusiastic food critics. The medieval taster had a different slogan: survive dinner, get paid tomorrow. Being a royal taster wasn't glamorous. The job paid well, because if it didn't, no one would take it, but the hours were short, mostly because the career expectancy was also short. Each day began with a round of heartfelt prayers and possibly a tearful goodbye to the family. Then came the tasting: a forkful of roast, a nibble of pie, a quick sip of wine. The taster had to sample everything before the king, queen, and important guests touched a single crumb. Why? All this paranoia, because poison was the true flavor enhancer of royal cuisine. If you wanted to climb the ladder in court, or skip a few spots in the line of succession, a little something extra in the stew was a classic move. Nobles, rivals, and even bored siblings were suspected of hiring shadowy cooks to spice up the royal menu with a pinch of arsenic or a dash of ground nightshade. Forget food allergies, this was full-on food warfare. Every meal was a minor panic attack, set to the music of clinking goblets and polite conversation. Was the soup supposed to be that color? Did the gravy always bubble like that? The taster's job was to find out by eating it first, with everyone else watching for signs of fainting, convulsing, or sudden philosophical musings about mortality. The tools of the trade were simple: a silver spoon, a hopeful heart, and a team of anxious physicians lurking in the shadows with leeches and prayers. There were protocols, too. After sampling a dish, the taster waited, sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes until the dessert course, for any ill effects. A good day ended with a polite burp. A bad day ended with everyone at the table reconsidering their career choices. Despite the risk, there was a certain prestige to the position. The taster was close to the king, privy to secrets, and occasionally rewarded with gifts or land for exceptional bravery or luck. Some tasters became trusted confidants, their loyalty proven over hundreds of near misses with disaster in pastry form. Of course, not all poisonings were dramatic. The most successful attempts were subtle. Symptoms delayed. Effects disguised as illness or bad luck. For every taster who dropped dead at the table, there were others who simply grew paler and quieter over weeks, slowly succumbing to mystery ailments and vague diagnoses from the royal doctor. Possibly a chill, possibly poison, possibly Tuesday. Some courts, especially the very paranoid, employed multiple tasters, each testing a different course. Others tried to outsmart the assassins by switching plates, swapping goblets, or randomly assigning food by lottery. This led to dinner parties that felt more like high-stakes bingo, with everyone eyeing their meat pie and wondering if it might be their last. Meanwhile, in the kitchens, the cooks worked under suspicion, servants whispered rumors, and the palace cat-eyed the leftovers with the kind of skepticism only cats can manage. Trust was rare. Everyone watched everyone else. Even the bread was suspect. Overindulgence was a sin, at least in public. The king could eat 3 geese in private, but in front of the court, he was expected to nibble modestly and make meaningful eye contact with a carrot. Picture the royal banquet. A long table groaning with dishes, roast swans, sugared almonds, pies taller than some of the guests. The smell alone could bring a grown peasant to tears. But you, dear monarch, are trapped in a delicate performance. Around you sit lords, bishops, and enough etiquette enforcers to fill a rulebook the size of a wagon wheel. All eyes are on your plate. You lift your fork, spear a single pea, and chew with the exaggerated dignity of someone who's never actually been hungry. The message is clear: self-control is next to godliness. And nothing says divine right like pretending you don't want seconds. Portion control wasn't just a matter of calories, it was a moral battlefield. Eating with abandon, especially in front of others, was considered gluttonous, even sinful. The medieval court believed in moderation for others. And nothing made the priests, chroniclers, and political enemies happier than catching a king sneaking an extra drumstick. If you did indulge, it had to be done in secret, away from the judgmental gaze of those who kept track of your waistline as closely as your war debts. To enforce this, a whole arsenal of social tricks evolved. Plates were small, cups were shallow, and the pace of dinner was glacial. The king's official taster took ages with every dish, buying precious time for royal digestion and ensuring nobody got too carried away with the gravy. Serving staff watched carefully for any sign of gluttony, ready to intervene with a subtle cough or the sudden strategic arrival of a bowl of pickled turnips, an edible buzzkill if ever there was one. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, it was a different story. The private royal supper was a lawless frontier of excess. 3 courses? Try 5. 1 roast goose? Let's make it a family reunion. There are whispered stories of monarchs who denied second helpings at public banquets, would later summon the kitchen staff for a midnight snack so lavish it required an extra priest just to bless the leftovers. But officially, in the candlelit glare of the court, restraint was the law. The pressure wasn't just on the king. Courtiers, too, learned to treat mealtimes as theatre. The cardinal with a sweet tooth became an artist at hiding marzipan in his sleeve. The countess, with an appetite for roast beef, invented a cough that conveniently covered her chewing. There was always that one unlucky soul who forgot the rules and reached for a second roll, only to be met with a collective gasp, and the kind of side-eye usually reserved for traitors and people who forgot to wash. This all led to some creative solutions. Food was artfully rearranged to look untouched. Napkins concealed uneaten bites, which were later spirited away by sympathetic servants, and everyone pretended not to notice the dog lurking under the table, doing the king's dirty work one stealth drumstick at a time. Of course, all this discipline was supposed to send a message. If the king could resist temptation, so could his subjects. Moderation was a virtue, unless you had the means, privacy, and appetite to do otherwise. The only thing bigger than the royal feasts was the conspiracy to act like you didn't care. Craving chicken? Sorry, that's for commoners. Here, you'll be expected to eat animals so rare and impractical, they're basically culinary Pokemonday. You sit down at the king's table, stomach rumbling, secretly hoping for something simple. But tonight's menu reads like the roll call at Noah's Ark. Roast swan, glazed peacock, and, wait for it, braised porpoise. These aren't just dinner options, they're flexes, designed to remind everyone that you're not just eating, you're making a statement. In the medieval royal world, the rarer and more inconvenient the animal, the higher your status. It's not just about being fed, it's about proving you have the power to commission a kitchen disaster at any time. The logic was flawless. If you're a king with unlimited boredom and a pathological need to show off, want chicken? Sorry, you'll have to slum it with the peasants. Instead, how about a goose stuffed with a duck, stuffed with a quail, all packed inside a sad, slightly confused swan? If it sounds like a recipe invented by someone sleep-deprived and showing off at the world's first food festival, that's because it pretty much was. Peacock, in particular, was the Instagram bait of its day. The cooks would roast it, then carefully redress it in its own feathers, complete with a gilded beak and sometimes a tiny, edible crown. Never mind that the meat itself was dry and almost impossible to chew. The real feast was for the eyes and for the guests to gossip about afterward. Did you see Lady Eleanor try to carve the peacock? I think she's still chewing. And then there was Swan. Yes, that elegant creature from every lakeside painting. In royal courts, swan wasn't just food, it was a privilege. In some places, hunting or serving swan was illegal unless you were a monarch, or at least knew the right people at the Ministry of Outrageous Dinners. The taste? Let's just say it's the kind of meal you remember more for the jaw workout than the flavor. But at least you got to brag about it later, which was half the point. Porpoise is where things get truly weird. During the fasting seasons, when meat was forbidden, royals turned to the loophole that anything aquatic counted as fish. Enter the porpoise, a creature that's sort of a fish, sort of a mammal, and entirely too large for your average stew pot. Chefs would boil, roast, or sometimes even jelly it. a phrase that should never be associated with marine life. It was not delicious, but it was a power move. Eating a porpoise said, "Not only do I have the money to buy one, I also have the staff willing to risk third-degree burns cooking it." The spectacle of the feast was half the fun. Musicians played, poets recited odes to roasted animals, and the unfortunate kitchen boys paraded in with platters taller than themselves. The more exotic the beast, the greater the bragging rights. There were times when the court would collectively pretend to enjoy beaver tail, believing it counted as fish for Lent. If it could be skinned, boiled, baked, or jellied, someone, somewhere, would serve it, preferably with a flourish and an audience. For the average guest, the experience was a mixture of awe, dread, and polite panic. Refuse a bite of the rare delicacy, and you risked insult. Swallow it, and you risked indigestion, or a story your grandchildren would never believe. Chocolate was once banned in some courts, then declared dangerously stimulating, and finally became the 17th century equivalent of sneaking vodka in your thermos. Picture the queen at her dressing table, velvet gown, jewels sparkling, a whole fleet of maids hovering nearby, and in her hand a dainty porcelain cup filled with chocolate. Not the sweet, friendly bar you snap off for a Tuesday pick-me-up, but a dark, thick, exotic potion bubbling with mysterious spices. In this moment, the queen is a rebel, a trendsetter, and a minor public health crisis, all in one. Chocolate arrived in Europe on a wave of Spanish galleons, dripping with the drama of the New World. It quickly became the hottest and hottestly contested drink of the aristocracy. At first, it was only for the very, very rich. Just a cup of the stuff cost as much as a new carriage, and drinking it was a public declaration that you were both wealthy and unbothered by things like dental bills. Monarchs who wanted to look extra powerful had artists paint them mid-sip, their lips artfully stained, their eyes twinkling with caffeine and mild danger. But with popularity came suspicion. Some doctors fretted that chocolate was heating to the blood. A medieval diagnosis meaning might give you ideas. Priests muttered that it inflamed passions, especially in women, and that a single cup could send a duchess down the path of dangerous self-indulgence, maybe even poetry. Some courts responded by banning chocolate outright, reasoning that any drink capable of making people this happy must be subversive, or at least bad for the moral order. Naturally, this made chocolate even more tempting. Queens and high-born ladies organized secret chocolate parties behind closed doors. Gossip raced through the palace. "Did you hear? The Duchess had 2 cups last night, and now she's redecorating the library and talking about liberty." Chocolate became the forbidden fruit of the boudoir, sipped from gilded cups with as much ceremony as a royal wedding, and twice as much intrigue. It wasn't just about the taste. The ritual of drinking chocolate was as luxurious as anything in the palace. The beans had to be roasted, ground, whipped into froth with rare spices, and then blended with sugar, a rare and expensive treat in its own right. Special servants, called chocolatiers, appeared in wealthy households, armed with copper pots and an air of extreme secrecy. The noise of the whisk, the scent of cinnamon and chili. These were the whispers of rebellion, floating down the corridors as courtiers pretended not to notice. Some kings, unable to resist the trend, publicly scorned chocolate while privately drinking gallons of it. Louis XIV, the original influencer, once banned chocolate at Versailles, only to commission his own private chocolatier for medical reasons. The real medical reason? Chocolate tasted better than boiled turnips and had fewer rules attached. Even outside of royal circles, chocolate's reputation was mixed. Some claimed it cured everything from headaches to heartbreak. Others said it caused dangerous ideas, like democracy, or even worse, dancing after dinner. The debate raged for decades. The one thing everyone agreed on? Nothing was more deliciously subversive than a steaming cup of chocolate when the church bells chimed for evening prayers. Not all booze was created equal. Royals drank wine, champagne, or anything imported at great expense. Beer was for peasants, unless you were German, in which case beer was for everyone, including the horses. It's banquet night in the royal palace, and the great hall is alive with the sound of clinking goblets and questionable toasts. Servants weave between the tables, balancing trays piled with silver pitchers and bottles, so expensive they practically require a security escort. But what's inside those fancy bottles isn't just a matter of taste, it's a matter of royal protocol, class, and a little bit of international snobbery. Let's start with wine. In most of Europe, wine was more than a drink. It was a lifestyle, an art form, and sometimes a replacement for actual water. The French and Italian courts in particular developed an entire universe of rules around the grape. There were wines for breakfast, light and sweet, wines for dinner, bold and expensive, and special ceremonial wines for those moments when the king needed to make a point, like outlasting his guests or toasting to a truce while silently planning a betrayal. The type, age, and even the vessel for wine were all carefully curated, with goblets so ornate you'd feel guilty drinking anything that didn't cost at least a month's wages. Champagne was another story. For centuries, it was the drink of true royalty, reserved for celebrations, royal births, and those nights when the queen needed to remind everyone who was in charge. A single pop of the cork could launch 100 jealous glances, and an entire courtier's career could hinge on not spilling a drop in front of the wrong duchess. Now, beer. Good, honest, hearty beer was a different story. In much of Europe, it was the drink of choice for farmers, craftsmen, and anyone who had to get up before noon to work in a field. The water was often dangerous, so beer was brewed weak enough to drink all day, but strong enough to keep you hydrated and happy, at least until the next tax collection. If you were a peasant, you could expect beer at every meal, even breakfast. For the royal family, though, drinking beer in public was about as acceptable as admitting you liked turnips. But then there was Germany. In the Holy Roman Empire, beer was more than a drink. It was a rite, a duty, and possibly a minor religious observance. German royals served beer at weddings, funerals, and official state visits. They brewed it in their own castles, experimented with secret recipes, and, on more than one occasion, accidentally invented new styles by leaving a cask in a snowbank. Beer was for everyone, and if you were lucky, your horse got a sip too, medieval multitasking at its finest. For most other courts, though, public consumption of beer was a delicate dance. The king could quietly enjoy a mug in his private chambers, but at feasts it was wine or nothing. And the more imported, the better. Sherry from Spain, Tokaji from Hungary, Sack from the far corners of the world. Each bottle was an edible, diplomatic incident, a status symbol you could get tipsy with. The only thing frowned upon more than drinking beer in public was being seen drinking out of a wooden cup. That was just embarrassing. Meanwhile, in the kitchens and servants' quarters, beer flowed freely. The real fun happened out of sight, with impromptu toasts, drinking songs, and the kind of dance moves that would get you banished from the throne room. Medieval and Renaissance banquets were restricted by law. 12 dishes at dinner, no more. Or the entire realm might implode from excess. It's dinner time in the castle, and you're about to witness a royal performance where even the plates have stage directions. On the surface, everything looks indulgent. Minstrels play in the corner, silver platters shine under candlelight, and the air is thick with the scent of roasting meat and fresh-baked bread. But behind the scenes, the most important number in the hall isn't the king's age or the queen's necklace count, it's 12. Not 11, not 13. 12. Welcome to the land of portioned plenty, where laws, Actual laws determine how many courses can hit the table. You might think these rules were designed to stop waste or protect common folk from hungry nobles, but really, they were more about optics and envy management. Too few courses, and you risk looking cheap. Too many, and the bishop starts muttering about the dangers of gluttony by candlelight. The royal household walked a tightrope. Feed the guests, impress the ambassadors, and keep the city's gossip mongers hungry for more. How did this system work? The meal began with a parade of appetizers, each one more confusing than the last. Jellied eels, almond paste shaped like fruit, a soup so thin you could see your own existential dread reflected in the bottom. These were followed by a series of roasts, some of which were birds, some of which were, alarmingly, mammals you wouldn't recognize unless you'd spent time in a medieval bestiary. All artfully arranged, all counted. Heaven forbid the kitchen accidentally slip in a 13th dish. Rumor had it that a single extra meat pie once triggered a minor scandal and 3 days of public penance for the cook. Why the limit? Well, like most things in royal life, it was part religious discipline, part class warfare, and part administrative headache. Medieval sumptuary laws, those delightful regulations about what you could eat, wear, or spend, were a constant balancing act. The church wanted to prevent sin, the treasury wanted to prevent debt, the local miller wanted to prevent everyone from starving after the king ordered 400 pastries for a Tuesday luncheon. 12 dishes became the sweet spot, enough to dazzle, not enough to send the local economy into famine. If you were a particularly ambitious monarch, you might try to game the system. Chefs would combine courses. 3 tiny birds stuffed inside a single pie, which counted as 1 dish, not 3. A salad with 12 different leaves was technically still just a salad. One clever queen reportedly had her cooks stack dishes in towers, creating the illusion of bounty while skirting the letter of the law. Auditors were occasionally called in to check that, yes, this was 12, not a sneaky baker's dozen. Meanwhile, the guests played their own game. How to pace yourself so you could survive all 12 without collapsing into your napkin. Every course brought new drama. Was it time for the spiced beef, or were you still on the interlude of pickled fish? A wrong move and you'd find yourself full before the main event, stuck sipping weak wine and hoping no one noticed you'd left your duck breast untouched. Doctors didn't just restrict food for fun, they prescribed menus. One day you're on the wet foods diet for melancholy, the next it's all dry toast and cold pears for excess heat. Being a royal meant never quite knowing what you'd be eating or why. Was tonight's supper a celebration, a cure, or a slow, diet-induced punishment? In the medieval and Renaissance courts, your personal doctor wielded more power over your plate than any chef. These were not men of culinary skill. These were professional warriors, armed with ancient textbooks, questionable logic, and a bottomless pit of dietary anxieties. Everything boiled down to the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Your body, it was believed, was a fragile stew that needed constant tweaking. Too much excitement? Clearly your blood was running wild. Feeling sluggish? That was the phlegm. If you dared to sneeze in public, the doctor was on it, prescribing you a week of leek broth, followed by an immediate switch to something drier and less likely to excite your spirits. The menu changed with your mood. If you looked cheerful, you'd be brought pomegranates and cool water. Seemed a bit gloomy? The royal physician prescribed boiled chicken and moist breads. For headaches, it was lettuce soup. For ambition, probably cold porridge and disappointment. A little too peppy in the morning? That meant extra prunes for supper. The royal kitchens became an edible pharmacy. Every dish designed to push you toward balance. A balance that, by some miracle, no one ever quite achieved. One of the most dreaded meals was the purge. Sometimes, just to keep things interesting, the doctor would declare that you needed a thorough cleansing of the humours. This meant a special menu of stewed rhubarb, boiled leeks, and strong, unflavoured broths. You could almost hear your taste buds weep. The royal family would shuffle through these days in silence, each silently blaming the others for their current lack of energy and enthusiasm. Even the seasons weren't safe. Summer was for cooling foods, cucumbers, cold fruits, and watery soups. Winter was for heating foods, like spiced wine and roast meats. Unless, of course, you showed signs of overheating, in which case, back to the lettuce you went. The theory was simple: balance opposites. The result was not. There were entire months when the royal menu looked more like a troubleshooting guide for broken livestock than a feast fit for a king. Of course, everyone tried to cheat. Cooks learned to sneak a little forbidden cheese into a pie, or slip a sugared almond into a bowl of approved gruel. Occasionally, a bold monarch would ignore the doctor's advice, indulge in a forbidden roast, and immediately find themselves the subject of a medical crisis. "Your Majesty," the physician would declare, "the roast boar has disturbed your black bile. I recommend nothing but boiled turnip water for a week." Guests weren't immune. Visiting ambassadors were often shocked to find their own diets scrutinized. "You look feverish," a courtier might say, before instructing the kitchen to serve only pears and old bread. Disagree, and risk offending both your host and the resident medical authority. At royal banquets, the safest course was to nibble whatever was placed before you, nod thoughtfully, and hope for a quiet evening with no side effects. Looking back, it's clear that royal eating wasn't just about status, it was about survival. Every meal was a gamble, every dish a calculated risk in the endless quest for perfect humoral balance. So tonight, as you settle into bed with your own menu of snacks, perhaps some ice cream, maybe a sneaky cookie, be grateful that your physician doesn't write your grocery list. Sleep well, and may your dreams be rich, flavorful, and medically unremarkable. Forks were scandalous. Real royalty used their fingers, and anyone caught using a three-pronged implement risked accusations of witchcraft or, worse, being Italian. The medieval and Renaissance royal table was a place of pomp, splendor, and, beneath the silk and silver, a daily test of dexterity. In an age before cutlery was king, hands did all the heavy lifting, grasping, tearing, scooping. Your fingers were your finest tools, as much a symbol of status as the rings that adorned them. To see a king gnawing on a drumstick or a queen delicately pinching pastries was to witness the true heart of courtly etiquette. Forks, when they first made their shy entrance into royal dining rooms, were not met with curiosity but with horror. What was this strange, spindly object? Why would anyone need more than 2 hands and a knife? Suspicion turned quickly to outrage. Some priests even condemned forks as the devil's tines, a tempting tool that separated food from the hand, and thus from the blessing of God. It didn't help that the only people confident enough to wield them were Italian merchants, forever a little too stylish and suspiciously clean. The court chroniclers delighted in tales of fork-related scandal. When the Byzantine princess Theophanu introduced the fork to Western Europe, her hosts gasped in dismay. "She eats with tiny tridents," they whispered. "Is she summoning Poseidon, or just incredibly bad at finger food?" Invitations to dinner with Theophanu became the stuff of legend. Guests practiced surreptitiously wiping their hands on their doublets, and cutlery drawers across the continent remained tragically empty. Royal etiquette manuals doubled down on hand eating. Entire chapters were devoted to proper tearing technique. One must break bread gracefully, never maul it. One must carve meat with authority, but never appear savage. The sauce was to be scooped with a crust or, if desperate, a discreet swipe of the pinky. Napkins became weapons of mass concealment, hiding greasy fingers and the occasional evidence of over-enthusiasm. The absence of forks did not mean a lack of style. The king might wear a velvet glove on one hand, removed only for the act of feasting. Dainty eaters perfected the art of the two-fingered pastry grab, while bolder courtiers wrestled roast pheasants with both hands, declaring it a sign of royal vigor. The spectacle of communal hand-washing bowls, perfumed with rosewater, provided the prelude and finale to every meal, accompanied by much splashing and an unspoken competition over who could look the most serene while degreasing. Yet, like all forbidden things, the fork's allure only grew. Young princes and cosmopolitan queens returning from Italy brought home whispers of cutlery chic. Sensing a shift in the winds of fashion, some courtiers secretly experimented, testing forks in private, only to hastily hide them at the sound of approaching footsteps. The boldest nobles smuggled forks into banquets, using them with exaggerated nonchalance and hoping the bishop didn't notice. Eventually, the fork won. By the late Renaissance, the tide had turned. Forks became acceptable, then trendy, and finally unavoidable, another symbol of royal refinement, joining the napkin and the thousand-piece place setting. But for generations, the true mark of royal dining was a set of well-washed hands, and the confidence to eat swan, pie, or even porpoise with nothing but your fingers and a complete disregard for future laundry. The king's digestive system was of national concern. Eating after sunset could cause nightmares, indigestion, or political instability. Royalty in the Middle Ages lived under a regime of rules so specific. Even their stomachs were not free. Forget midnight snacks, those weren't just frowned upon. They were practically a threat to the stability of the realm. The court physician, a man whose job was part doctor, part oracle, and part food inspector, decreed that no food should pass the royal lips once the sun dipped below the battlements. The reasoning? Apparently the digestive process was as delicate as court intrigue, and the darkness brought out not just ghosts, but also humors with sinister agendas. Evening in the castle was a time of gentle panic. The servants would watch the windows, tracking the sinking sun with the intensity of astronomers. Kitchen boys raced to deliver supper before the bell tolled, and the royal clockkeeper developed a nervous twitch. If you found yourself still holding a fork at dusk, you had a decision to make. Inhale your food like a commoner, or risk spending the night wrestling with what the doctors called the terrors. Those terrors ranged from indigestion and gas, public enemy number one in a court obsessed with etiquette, to the much more abstract threat of bad dreams, which could allegedly influence state decisions. This curfew wasn't just superstition, it was official policy, sometimes written down and strictly enforced. It was believed that the stomach slept after dark, and disturbing it was not only bad manners but borderline heretical. You, as a royal, were required to be a beacon of health and restraint. Even if your stomach was rumbling, you'd smile politely and declare, "No, I couldn't eat another bite," as your eyes drifted longingly to the last slice of pie. Royal physicians took their curfew duties seriously. Some would stage evening stomach checks, pressing cold hands to noble abdomens, and making dire predictions if they suspected an unauthorized grape had been consumed after sunset. The risk of a sleepless, haunted night was a favorite warning. "Sire," the doctor might say, "an after-dark pastry will surely bring you visions of defeat at the next battle." Never mind the real dangers of ruling a kingdom. The true threat was clearly late-night cheese. The rule didn't just apply to the king. Courtiers, ever eager to imitate and impress, adopted the curfew with grim enthusiasm. The lucky ones stashed snacks in their chambers, developing elaborate systems for smuggling cold chicken under their robes. The less lucky resigned themselves to digestive teas, which tasted like disappointment. and were brewed by candlelight with much sighing and side-eye. As for the common people, they were mostly too busy surviving to care about royal stomach drama. But in the rare event, a peasant managed to sneak into the castle as a servant, the first lesson was, never, ever deliver food after dark unless you wanted to be blamed for the Queen's nightmares, the King's gout, or the collapse of diplomatic negotiations with Hungary. Ironically, the morning after a night of strict curfew, the court awoke convinced of their own virtue and their own emptiness. Breakfast, always an event, was consumed with the fervour of a people who had narrowly escaped disaster. The king's first bite was a political act, and the sigh of relief that followed was echoed across the kingdom. So, as you curl up for the night, maybe with a secret snack tucked under your pillow, take a moment to appreciate your freedom from royal mealtime tyranny. No curfews, no doctors lurking in the shadows, no fear that a midnight cookie will topple your government. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with snacks, peace, and absolutely zero political instability. Between fasts, abstinence days, and religious holidays, it's a miracle any royal ever saw a roast. Welcome to perpetual meatless Mondays. Forced by the church and tradition, step into the ornate, chilly dining hall of a medieval castle. The fires crackle, the courtiers shuffle hungrily, and the royal cook stands pale with worry. For today is not just another day. It's another day when the king cannot have meat. The church calendar rules all. Fish is permitted, lentils are encouraged, and the only thing forbidden is a shred of culinary joy. For much of the year, the king's kitchen is transformed from a palace of roasted boars and sizzling venison into a museum of vegetable-based compromise. The priests, the doctors, and the grandmothers with suspiciously sharp hearing all seem to agree. Meatless meals are good for the soul, the body, and perhaps even the treasury. Publicly, the king nods solemnly. Privately, he mourns for the lost lamb shank. The menu on a meatless day is a festival of monotony. Bowls of pottage, grey and thick, glisten with turnips, parsnips, and the faintest whiff of parsley. There's fish, of course, salted, dried, or, if you're especially unlucky, reconstituted with questionable sauces. Lentils make a daily appearance, as do beans, peas, and whatever green thing the gardener could yank out of the earth at the last minute. It's a parade of penance, with every mouthful a reminder that virtue tastes mostly like mud and regret. As always, the church is watching. The idea was to inspire piety and self-restraint, though for many royals it mostly inspired new forms of cheating. The art of loophole cuisine was perfected in these meatless periods. Is that a fish pie? Or did the clever cook sneak in a bit of duck and call it river chicken? Could eels really count as fish if they spent half their lives in mud? Theologians and chefs clashed regularly, each armed with scripture and, occasionally, a frying pan. The king's table was a hotbed of innovation. If you couldn't have meat, you could at least make the vegetables nervous. Mock meats appeared, pulses shaped into suspiciously familiar forms, almond milk cheese pretending to be something worth spreading. Feast days became performance art, with chefs unveiling ever more elaborate displays of fish disguised as game, all in the name of righteousness and royal appetite. Naturally, not everyone was fooled. There were always the virtue police, confessors, rival nobles, even ambitious servants, keeping an eye out for forbidden feasting. The risk of scandal was real. A single sausage, discovered on wrong day, could spark a sermon, a diplomatic incident, or a decade of awkward family dinners. If you were caught, your penance might be public humiliation, a fine, or, worst of all, a week of nothing but cold peas and introspection. Meanwhile, in private, the king and his friends fantasized about the return of meat with the kind of longing usually reserved for lost loves or missed inheritances. Jokes about bean fatigue made the rounds. Rumours swirled of secret roasts held after midnight, attended only by the most trusted friends and a particularly fast dog. The Queen, ever practical, kept a stash of salted ham locked away for emergencies, national crises, or more likely, a particularly bad lentil stew. And so, year after year, the cycle repeated. Meatless Mondays gave way to meatless Tuesdays, and sometimes meatless months, until the first legal roast could finally be served with fanfare and collective relief. The king, beaming, would carve the roast himself, surrounded by cheers, and the church would nod, satisfied that another season of restraint had been survived. Royals weren't allowed a private meal. Even breakfast involved a crowd of gawkers, taste testers, and at least one guy in a hat, 3 feet tall. Imagine waking up, bleary-eyed and hungry, hoping to steal a quiet moment with a humble bowl of pottage, or maybe just a chunk of yesterday's bread. No such luck. The moment you shuffle into the great hall in your royal dressing gown, the performance begins. Servants line the walls, ready to spring into action if your spoon so much as glances sideways. Nobles gather, eager for gossip and a glimpse of royal chewing technique. In comes the official taster, solemn and pale, followed closely by the master of the napkins, whose primary skill is folding cloth into shapes only mildly threatening. The medieval and Renaissance courts treated meals like public theatre, except instead of applause, you get anxiety. Breakfast is a group project. Lunch is a command performance. And dinner is a full-blown festival of social scrutiny. Even the simplest meal is scheduled, announced, and attended by a cast of dozens. The Queen might share a bench with her handmaidens, each pretending not to notice if Her Majesty prefers the cheese. A bishop sits nearby, ready to bless or critique, and, somewhere in the background, a scribe is taking notes for the royal chronicles. The king requested an extra egg. The room trembled. This constant audience isn't just for a show. Every move you make is a political message. Eating alone could be seen as secret plotting, or, worse, admitting that you didn't want to share your boiled turnips. The king's public table was both a privilege and a punishment, forcing him to demonstrate generosity, humility, and, occasionally, his ability to not drop sauce down his shirt in front of foreign ambassadors. If the king passed a dish to someone, it was diplomacy. If he ignored you, it was an international incident in the making. Naturally, the pressure led to all sorts of strange rituals. Special rules governed who could sit, who could stand, and exactly when the trumpet should sound to signal the arrival of the soup. The Grand Almoner made sure the poor were fed scraps in the king's name, while the king himself tried not to look too relieved at being served first. Even the food itself became symbolic. An extra spoonful of porridge for a favoured courtier, a cold shoulder of mutton for a rival. Privacy was a luxury the royal family simply couldn't afford. Servants needed to see what the royals wanted. Cooks needed to monitor reactions to new dishes, and the ever-present guards needed to make sure no one slipped arsenic into the breadbasket. Occasionally, a noble might stage an elaborate ruse to eat alone, claiming urgent matters of state or tending to meditate. The result? A crowd would gather anyway, just in case they missed a juicy morsel of scandal or a new method of holding a fork. But the real masters of the public meal were the courtiers. They watched for clues, who laughed at the king's jokes, who refused the goose, who sneaked a grape under the table for the spaniel. Every glance and gesture was noted, debated, and, by bedtime, turned into a minor legend. For every royal yawn or spill, 100 versions spread through the palace, each more dramatic than the last. In the end, eating was less about food and more about the spectacle. The simple act of breakfast became a chess match, an audition, and an endurance test rolled into one. Leftovers were considered unwholesome or even dangerous. Eat it fresh or feed it to the dogs. But don't you dare microwave that boar's head. Picture the royal dining hall after a feast. The candles flicker low, half a goose sits abandoned on its platter, and the air is thick with the scent of roast and regret. You, a king surrounded by luxury and half-eaten pies, might imagine that tomorrow's breakfast is already solved. But think again. In the world of medieval and Renaissance royalty, leftovers weren't just unfashionable, they were borderline criminal. The rule was simple. If it wasn't eaten fresh, it wasn't eaten at all. Medieval medical theory insisted that reheated food was dangerous, unhealthy at best, deadly at worst. The logic was vague and a little terrifying. Supposedly, old food bred bad humors, mysterious invisible forces that lurked in yesterday's stew and last night's bread. If you reheated a dish, you risked not just indigestion, but possibly a spontaneous loss of virtue, sanity, or the king's temper. As a result, the palace kitchens worked at a frenzied pace, determined to deliver meals hot, fresh, and in comically excessive quantities. The head cook was less a chef and more an event planner with a gambling problem, always betting on the right amount to serve. Too little, and you risked public humiliation. Too much, and tomorrow's menu was a diplomatic puzzle. What do you do with a small army's worth of cold venison? The answer: feed it to the dogs, the servants, or, if you were feeling charitable, the local poor, who were usually thrilled to get anything, reheated or not. But no royal would be caught dead eating last night's pottage, no matter how delicious it had been the day before. The kitchen staff developed elaborate systems for hiding leftovers. Some dishes went out the back door before anyone noticed, while others were repurposed in ways so creative only the bravest taster could tell the difference. Occasionally, a particularly thrifty monarch would try to bend the rules. Maybe you sneak down to the kitchens for a cold drumstick, or convince the royal physician that slightly aged bread was just a sign of character. The result? Scandal. Court gossips thrived on tales of kings who ate leftovers. Did you hear? His Majesty ate yesterday's pie. It was the medieval equivalent of being spotted at the discount bakery. Your reputation, and possibly your reign, could crumble over a reheated morsel. This allergy to leftovers wasn't just about superstition. It was about status. Eating fresh food, prepared in abundance and cleared away at the end of each meal, was a sign that you were rich enough not to worry about waste. The poor might scrape their plates for a week. A true royal would sooner go hungry than be seen gnawing on last night's roast. And of course, there were the dogs. Royal hounds were the real winners in this system, feasting on platters of roast, pastry, and cheese that would make a modern chef weep. Some chroniclers suggested that palace dogs lived better than many nobles, and certainly ate better than most peasants. If you ever find yourself reincarnated in a medieval court, consider aiming for the role of chief food disposal officer with 4 legs and a tail. Today, of course, we celebrate leftovers as a sensible, even comforting tradition. There's nothing like cold pizza or reheated soup to make you feel rich in time and taste. But as you curl up tonight, full from whatever you ate, fresh or not, be grateful for modern refrigerators, microwaves, and the simple freedom to save a little for later. Sometimes, the only thing more dangerous than following royal food restrictions was breaking them. Fines, imprisonment, or a very pointed note from the bishop could be your reward for a midnight snack. You might think being king means doing whatever you want, eating what you please, when you please, and how you please. Not so fast. The royal dinner table is a high-wire act, and the consequences for a single misstep are as serious as a poorly timed trumpet fanfare. When your every meal is a public performance and your chef carries more anxiety than the royal treasurer, breaking the rules of dining isn't just impolite. It's an existential threat. The restrictions are everywhere. Fast days, feast days, the mysterious category known as half-fast days, and endless lists of forbidden ingredients. You're supposed to set a moral example, not tempt the masses with forbidden roast pork or, heaven forbid, a second helping of pudding. The eyes of the court are always on you, ready to spot the tiniest slip. Is that butter on your bread during Lent? That's not just a culinary offense. That's a scandal ready to explode, with consequences reaching far beyond the kitchen. Medieval and Renaissance courts had entire teams devoted to enforcing food rules. The master of the table tracked what was served, the confessor tracked what was eaten, and the kitchen boys tracked everything else. The system was rigged for maximum drama. If you were caught cheating, say, sneaking a piece of bacon on a Friday, or breaking out the chocolate stash on a day of penance, you'd find yourself on the wrong end of royal justice. At best, this meant an official reprimand and a scolding in front of the servants. At worst, you could be fined, stripped of privileges, or sent to a chilly cell with nothing but bread and water, and probably not even the good bread. Sometimes, the punishments were deliciously ironic. There are stories of kings and courtiers condemned to public penance for breaking dietary laws, forced to parade through town, heads bowed, while the crowd threw meatless pottage at them. Others received letters from the bishop so stern they could curdle milk, outlining in painful detail the spiritual consequences of eating cheese on the wrong day. Of course, not every act of food rebellion ended in humiliation. Some courtiers played the long game, developing elaborate codes, secret signals, and even double-bottomed platters to sneak forbidden treats past the eyes of the law. The history of royal banquets is also a history of culinary espionage. Imagine the chef who hides an illicit sausage inside a fish pie, or the lady-in-waiting who signals with her napkin when the coast is clear for a midnight snack. But with every act of rebellion came risk. The courts were filled with informants, ambitious rivals, moralistic priests, and, on more than one occasion, the Queen herself. The result was an endless cycle of suspicion and guilt, in which the fear of getting caught sometimes outweighed the actual pleasure of eating the forbidden food. Then there were the banquets themselves, ostentatious affairs where temptation was at its peak and the rules most easily broken. A guest could be undone by a careless bite, a cook by a misunderstood instruction, a king by a moment of weakness. Legend tells of nobles who met their downfall not in battle, but at the dinner table, betrayed by a forbidden morsel and the relentless machinery of courtly morality. Think brunch is a modern invention? Think again. Royals often had to wait until the church bell rang at noon before they could even dream of nibbling stale bread. Early breakfast was considered suspiciously sinful, so mornings in the palace were a delicate dance between fainting gracefully and pretending you never wanted pancakes anyway. It's morning in the royal bedchamber. You awaken to the sound of distant bells and the faint hope of breakfast. But as sunlight creeps across your canopy bed, reality sets in. You, the monarch, will not be tasting so much as a crumb before midday. The reason? The church calendar rules your gut as ruthlessly as your court. And the rule is clear. No eating before the appointed hour. To be caught snacking early would be to declare yourself spiritually bankrupt. Or, even worse, a glutton with no self-control. So the court rises with empty stomachs, energy levels somewhere between medieval zombie and mildly resentful. Servants bustle about in quiet misery, dressing their royal charges and lacing up layers of clothing with the sort of enthusiasm usually reserved for funeral processions. In the corridors, dignitaries and nobles exchange polite nods and not-so-polite stomach grumbles, each one hoping nobody notices the faint, rumbling soundtrack to their morning gossip. Time moves slowly when you're hungry. There are prayers to be said, letters to read, and, if you're unlucky, an early morning council meeting where everyone looks suspiciously pale. The king's advisors, usually sharp as hawks, now look dazed and distracted, eyes drifting toward the sun as if trying to will it to reach its zenith just a little faster. The Queen's ladies in waiting, ordinarily fountains of courtly wit, manage only the most basic conversation, each one fantasizing about toasted bread and a quiet corner in which to eat it. As noon approaches, the mood shifts from pious suffering to barely contained excitement. The kitchens, dormant for hours, suddenly explode with activity. Fires are stoked, bread is sliced, and the royal coffee, well, watered wine or weak ale, caffeine is centuries away, is poured with trembling hands. The moment the church bell rings, it's a stampede, dignified, but just barely. The royal breakfast is a curious affair, far from the bounty you might expect. It's typically a modest meal, some cold bread, perhaps a bit of pottage, maybe the luxury of a little cheese, or a few sad-looking apples. But the mood is triumphant. You've survived another morning, and every bite tastes like victory. There are strict rules, of course. Eating too much, too quickly, or with too much obvious enjoyment is frowned upon. The bishop is always lurking, ready to remind everyone that breakfast is a privilege, not a party. But not everyone plays by the rules. Some royals are masters of stealth snacking, bribing servants to smuggle them a crust of bread or an illicit fig before the noon bell. Others claim to be sampling food for charity, nibbling in the shadows like saints in training. It's all part of the game, keeping up appearances while secretly wishing for the sweet relief of modern breakfast culture. For the peasants who rise before dawn and work the fields on an empty stomach, the idea of delaying breakfast is just another cruel joke. But for the royal court, it's a ritual, a public test of self-discipline and, at times, endurance. Papaya from India? Pineapple from the Caribbean? Not so fast. For many centuries, foreign fruits were viewed with deep suspicion, rumored to cause fevers, digestive mayhem, or unseemly bursts of joy. Only the bravest or most rebellious royals dared taste them. And woe to the courtier who snuck in a forbidden mango. You could lose your job, your honor, and your place at the dessert table. The royal dining table may have gleamed with gold, but beneath the glint of candlesticks lurked a genuine terror. Fruit from faraway lands. Each new arrival was greeted like an invasive species, part marvel, part menace. The moment an ambassador from the tropics unveiled a pineapple, the court split into two camps: those who whispered about its aphrodisiac powers, and those convinced it could trigger a bout of royal madness. In an age before refrigeration, just getting exotic fruit to the palace was an expedition worthy of epic poetry. Pineapples spent months bouncing in crates across wild seas. Mangoes endured the perils of highway robbers and mold. If a papaya made it to your table, it was less a snack and more a message. You had serious connections, or serious disregard for the safety of your internal organs. Naturally, suspicion was the order of the day. Doctors huddled in corners, debating whether these newcomers could unbalance the humors or cause spontaneous poetry at dinner. Papaya, one royal physician wrote, is apt to provoke enthusiasm. In a court obsessed with dignity, enthusiasm was more dangerous than plague. Then there was the etiquette nightmare. How, exactly, did one approach a pineapple? Could you bite a mango in public, or was that a private affair? The risk of juice dribbling down a royal chin was almost too much to bear. Some kings insisted on elaborate fruit-tasting ceremonies, complete with napkin bearers, tasters, and a priest standing by just in case anyone required last rites after an especially alarming lychee. Courtly gossip only added to the paranoia. Did the Duchess's rosy glow come from her secret stash of guava, or was she simply delighted to be alive? Was the prince's mysterious rash the fault of an overripe banana, or just bad fashion choices? In a world where every illness had a story, and every food had a moral, the arrival of foreign fruit could topple a reputation as quickly as a rotten fig. Still, for the most adventurous royals, fruit became the ultimate luxury, the edible equivalent of riding a tiger into the throne room. To be seen sampling papaya or offering pineapple to a guest was the height of daring, a way to show off both wealth and an iron constitution. Rumors swirled of queens who craved imported melons, of dukes who hosted secret feasts featuring nothing but guava and risk. Of course, there were always the disasters. One poor baron, having indulged too freely in unfamiliar cherries, was laid up with stomach pains for a week and became the cautionary tale of his generation. A courtier who presented an unvetted pomegranate to the king found himself banished to the farthest reaches of the estate, rumor had it, for crimes against digestion. And yet, slowly, tastes changed. As centuries rolled by, curiosity began to win out over caution. What was once feared became coveted. Exotic fruits went from forbidden to fashionable, decorating banquet tables and inspiring new levels of culinary one-upmanship. The greatest compliment a host could receive was a guest fainting with delight at a slice of pineapple, ideally without actual fainting. Ever wonder why so many medieval paintings of saints look hungry? That's because royal menus on holy days were built around endless bowls of thin, sanctified soup, preferably without salt, flavor, or personality. The idea was to feed the soul, not the stomach. Spoiler: everyone's soul ended up deeply, deeply disappointed. In the candlelit chill of the royal hall, servants filed in with great ceremony, bearing bowls of what could optimistically be called broth. The table was a sea of shimmering white linens and gleaming silver spoons, but the only thing less substantial than the soup was the royal appetite. Holy days were meant for spiritual reflection and, apparently, culinary suffering. Out went the hearty stews and roast meats. In came the great watery tide, the sacred soup. The ingredients for these broths were chosen with the utmost care. If by care you mean the ability to remove anything resembling flavor. No meat, obviously. No fat, no onions, no spices. Those might provoke the senses and tempt the mind towards sin. Instead, the pot would hold a few tired vegetables, a handful of wilted greens, and maybe a carrot that looked like it had given up long before Lent even started. The result was a bowl of humility, the kind that forced everyone to contemplate their place in the universe and their plans for sneaking a snack later. This was food designed to be endured, not enjoyed. The king, usually the center of attention at any feast, spent these meals wearing his most pious expression, forcing down spoonfuls of tepid broth and pretending it was all part of the divine plan. The queen did her best to look inspired, while the courtiers exchanged glances that said, "Do you think there's any bread left in the kitchens?" The bishops, meanwhile, watched with the smug satisfaction of people who knew that flavor was a gateway drug to perdition. Behind the scenes, the royal cooks suffered most of all. Used to creating culinary masterpieces, they now spent their days boiling water and praying that nobody would notice if they slipped in a turnip. Once in a while, a truly rebellious chef would try to smuggle a pinch of herbs into the pot, only to face interrogation by the confessor and a stern reminder about the dangers of overly joyful broth. The stakes were high. One wrongly spiced soup could spark a sermon, a scandal, or, worst of all, a lecture from the royal physician about the perils of warming the blood. And yet, the ritual continued year after year. Holy days were marked not just by the ringing of bells, but by the sound of spoons scraping hopelessly at the bottom of empty bowls. Even the palace dogs lost interest. wandering off in search of dropped crusts or a more forgiving parish. For the truly devout, the ordeal of sacred soup was a badge of honor. For everyone else, it was a masterclass in the fine art of pretending to be grateful. Still, there was a peculiar comfort in the monotony. The sameness of the meal, the predictability of disappointment, brought people together in mutual suffering. Jokes were whispered, eyes were rolled, and more than one saintly portrait was painted with a look of quiet hunger and deep spiritual doubt. Before sugar became the backbone of modern dentistry bills, it was strictly regulated in royal courts. Too much marzipan could earn you a side-eye from the bishop, and eating candied fruit during Lent was considered a scandal worthy of gossip, penance, and maybe even a sullen sermon about your immortal soul. Sweetness was not just a matter of taste, it was a matter of public virtue. To serve a lavish dessert was to flirt with sin itself. The medieval world viewed sugar with a suspicion reserved for sorcery and suspiciously talented jesters. Cakes and tarts were dangerous. Marzipan was a moral hazard, and jelly was the spiritual equivalent of dancing on the church roof during Sunday service. It wasn't just the bishops who policed sugar. Medical experts, ever eager to justify their keep, warned that sweets heated the blood, stirred up unlawful passions, and might, on a bad day, cause both toothache and impure thoughts. The royal doctor would eye the dessert table with the grim resolve of a man who's lost one too many patients to an unfortunate incident with candied almonds. Of course, the church's stance on dessert was the most creative. Sugar was associated with worldly pleasure. As Lent approached, strict rules came into play. For 40 days, every spoonful of honey was eyed with suspicion, and any guest caught sneaking a sugared date might be in for an awkward public confession. "Forgive me, Father, for I have nibbled a nougat." Gossip flew faster than the kitchen boys. One queen's weakness for marchpane balls inspired 2 sermons, 3 rounds of penance, and at least one nervous breakdown among the palace confectioners. But, as with all things royal, the rules were made for bending. Behind closed doors, sweets found their way to private chambers, disguised as medicinal lozenges or digestive aids. Royal kitchens became laboratories of secrecy, concocting cakes so subtle in their sweetness they could be passed off as holy bread if the bishop walked in. The cleverest cooks invented fasting desserts, recipes using almond milk, dried fruit, and a heroic dose of prayer, so that the royal family could indulge with plausible deniability. On feast days, though, all bets were off. The end of Lent was marked by a sugar explosion of biblical proportions. Tables groaned under the weight of glazed pastries, spun sugar sculptures, and towers of jellied pears. It was a scene of joyful chaos. Courtiers abandoning all restraint, bishops wincing in resignation, and children losing all sense of decorum as they dove for honeyed figs. For a brief, glorious window, dessert was not only permitted, it was a sign of divine favor. Even the sternest monk could be seen sneaking a spoonful of custard, but the memory of restraint always lingered. Each bite of cake came with the faint echo of judgment. Was this tart really worth the risk to your soul? Would the bishop notice that your lips were sticky with forbidden sweetness? Could you survive another round of advice from the royal dentist, who regarded every marzipan rose as a personal insult to the dental profession? For most, the answer was yes. The allure of sugar was simply too strong. Like so many things in royal life, the pleasure was in the pursuit, the danger, and the delicious knowledge that tomorrow it might all be taken away. Think sneaking to the kitchen at 1 a.m. is bad. Imagine doing it as a king. Midnight snacks were not just frowned upon, they were literally considered acts of gluttony, heresy, or proof you were in league with the devil. Getting caught with a crust of bread after dark could land you in spiritual hot water, or worse, force you to listen to a 3-hour lecture on self-control by the royal confessor. Imagine it. The castle is shrouded in moonlight. The corridors are silent except for the creaks and groans of ancient stone. And your royal stomach is staging a quiet rebellion. You lie in bed. Visions of roast chicken and yesterday's apple tart dancing through your head. Knowing that not even a crumb is allowed until dawn. The royal physicians and confessors have spoken. Food after dark is the gateway to sin, sickness, and possibly eternal damnation. It's not hunger, they say, but temptation, the sort that leads straight to the confessional. But sometimes, temptation wins. Maybe the grand banquet was a little sparse. No one wanted seconds in front of the bishop. Or maybe the latest batch of pottage simply wasn't up to your royal standards. Perhaps the only thing more unappetizing than the official dinner was the idea of facing another 6 hours with nothing but your own regrets for company. Whatever the reason, the call of the midnight snack is strong. So, armed with nothing but slippers, a candle, and the vague hope of plausible deniability, you slip through the corridors toward the kitchens. Here begins the real challenge. Castle kitchens at night are haunted territory, not by ghosts, though you're never quite sure, but by the ever-watchful staff, guards, and the occasional insomniac monk. The scullery maid might be fetching water. The head cook could be prepping for tomorrow's feast, muttering about the king's mysterious appetite. One wrong step, and you risk being discovered with a chunk of bread or, worse, a slice of cold pie. The punishment? That depends. Maybe it's confession and a stern sermon on the dangers of gluttony. Maybe it's an official rebuke from the royal council. For serial offenders, there are even stories of enforced fasting as penance. Days spent eating nothing but the blandest broth, while everyone else enjoys their cheese and honey. And the consequences weren't just spiritual. Medieval courts loved a spectacle. If you were caught, word spread fast. A simple slip, crumbs on your robe, a suspicious stain on your sleeve, and you could find yourself the star of the next day's gossip. The butler's apprentice would smirk. The steward's wife would recount your downfall, one dramatic detail at a time. Your moment of midnight indulgence would go down in history as the Great Goose-Leg Incident, forever immortalized in oil paint and rumor. The reasoning behind all this is half superstition, half social control. Medieval doctors insisted that eating at night disturbed the humors, causing nightmares, indigestion, and moral decay. The stomach, like the soul, must rest after sunset. One particularly dramatic physician once declared. The church doubled down, declaring that nighttime was for prayer, sleep, and maybe a little light suffering, not culinary indulgence. To give in to midnight cravings was to admit weakness. And no king, queen, or ambitious courtier wanted to be caught weak. The only thing worse than being hungry after dark was being found out. This gave rise, naturally, to an entire underground culture of snack smuggling. Clever royals developed secret codes and signals for trusted servants. Bring me the moon cheese, or deliver the apples when the bell tolls twice. Some palace kitchens had hidden cupboards where tiny pies or hunks of bread could be stashed for emergencies. Secret doors led from private chambers to pantries, the way mapped out only for the most loyal aides. Even the palace cats got in on the act, lured with the promise of scraps and sworn to silence. Somewhere, in the dead of night, a spaniel was feasting on roast duck and contemplating its place in the chain of command. There were, of course, cautionary tales. Chronicles tell of kings who lost their dignity, or worse, their composure, when discovered crouched over a pie in the dark. A startled guard could set off a chain of chaos. A dropped tart, a candle snuffed out, a parade of staff stumbling upon a ruler at his most vulnerable, jam on his chin and guilt in his eyes. Court painters immortalized the most notorious scandals in oil and rumor. The phrase "caught with your hand in the bread box" became shorthand for royal shame. And if public embarrassment wasn't enough, there were always the confessor's punishments. The spiritual lectures could last longer than most royal decrees. The confessor would pace the floor, reciting tales of ancient kings undone by appetite, of saints who survived on nothing but dew and prayer, and of the infernal dangers lurking in after-hours dining. He'd extol the virtues of restraint, sprinkle in a few parables, and conclude with the reminder that nothing good ever happened after midnight, especially not pie. Despite the risk, the midnight snack remained an irresistible draw, a fleeting, rebellious act in a world of rigid control. Every crumb tasted of defiance, every forbidden bite, a private victory over the rules, the watchful eyes, and the empty rituals of restraint. In the end, the king might go back to bed, stomach soothed, heart pounding, and resolve renewed. At least until tomorrow night, when the shadows lengthened, the hunger returned, and the distant promise of one more secret bite beckoned from the darkness. So tonight, as you tuck yourself in beneath a mountain of blankets, maybe take a moment to appreciate the humble, glorious freedom of your own midnight snacks. Imagine, just for a second, if you lived a few centuries ago and wanted nothing more than to sneak a bite of leftover pizza. Before you even reached the fridge, you'd need a signed letter from the bishop, 3 suspiciously sober butlers, and at least 1 priest on speed dial for an emergency exorcism. That cold slice you enjoy in peace would have been a full-blown diplomatic incident in a royal palace. Surviving a single day at a royal table meant dodging flavor, hiding your hunger, and remembering that your doctor could outlaw cheese at any moment. No warning, no appeal, just blandness as a medical prescription. Food was never just food. It was a daily gauntlet of politics, status, and ever-shifting medical fads. One wrong bite could mean indigestion, yes, but also fines, exile, or the kind of public shaming only a bishop with a personal grudge could deliver. Dinner wasn't just dinner. It was an obstacle course for your taste buds, your reputation, and sometimes your soul. Yet through it all, people found a way to adapt, to laugh, and, most importantly, to cheat. A secret strawberry slipped behind a tapestry, a wedge of forbidden cheese smuggled in a sleeve, a hasty gulp of beer before the priest noticed, all tiny acts of rebellion that prove the eternal power of food to inspire hope and disobedience in equal measure. History, for all its discomforts and indignities, is also a story of people refusing to settle for less, finding a little comfort, a little pleasure, and a little flavor, even if it meant breaking a few rules and risking a stern lecture or a midnight exile. So as you drift off tonight, in a world where garlic is legal, cheese is celebrated, and absolutely nobody is counting how many eggs you eat on a Friday, maybe whisper a quiet thank you to your ancestors. The kings, the queens, the long-suffering royal tasters, people who braved blandness, spiritual lectures, and suspicious soups, all so future generations could enjoy the miracle of snacks without paperwork. Their caution, their creativity, and their stubborn determination to find joy in the face of restriction paved the way for the glorious, reckless luxury of eating what you want, when you want, even if it's just a slightly suspicious slice of leftover pie at 2 a.m. Because history isn't only hardship, it's proof of human resilience, adaptability, and the never-ending quest for comfort food, whether that means poached pears in a golden bowl or a grilled cheese in your pajamas. No matter the time period, people have always found ways to nourish themselves, to share a laugh, and to push gently back against the rules, one forbidden bite at a time. So tonight, as you close your eyes, let yourself be grateful for the small freedoms, for hot water, cold milk, and the simple, spectacular privilege of food that brings you joy. Let your mind wander, knowing that the only restriction on your dreams tonight is whether you want to be a king, a queen, or the world's most rebellious royal chef. Good night. May your sleep be deep, your dreams wonderfully absurd, and your fridge forever free of medieval rules. And may you wake up tomorrow with the courage to eat breakfast whenever you please. No confessor required.